It's the last week of August. It's 3100 BCE, and you're standing on the east bank of the Nile, about 400 miles south of the sea, watching brown water slide past you at roughly the speed of a walking man. 3 months ago, you could have crossed this on foot. Right now, it's 6 meters deep, which is 20 feet for the Americans in the audience, and close to a mile wide. There is no money. Nobody alive on this river has ever seen a coin. There's no written law, no police, no court, no border, no army you belong to, no tax office, and no word yet for the country you are standing in. There is a mud brick bin on the high ground behind you with your grain in it and somebody else's clay seal pressed over the door. There's a boat coming downstream, and there's a man on it, and you're going to bow to him. Not bow as in polite, not bow as in you're personally afraid of him. He's a normal-sized man in a boat, and there are considerably more of you than there are of him. Bow as in your face goes into the mud, and you put it there yourself, without being told, the way you'd pull your hand off a hot pot. Nobody in your family did that 300 years ago. Nobody anywhere on Earth did it 10,000 years ago. And now it's automatic, because this is the actual question, and it's got nothing to do with pyramids. We look at ancient Egypt and we see the big stuff, gold masks, a god king on a throne with a fake beard strapped to his chin. Anybody can build a big pile of rocks if they've got a river, a lot of rope, and 30 years. Pyramids are a logistics problem, and every civilization that gets big enough eventually solves a logistics problem. The hard problem, the one that had to be solved several thousand times in villages nobody has ever excavated, is this. How do you get a free person, somebody who has never in their life taken an order from a stranger, to hand over roughly a third of everything they grow, every year, forever, without you standing there with a weapon every single time? That's not an engineering problem. That's a compliance problem, and it got solved on this river earlier and harder than almost anywhere else on Earth. So today we're going through all of it. A hole in the ground with a lid on it, bone tags the size of a postage stamp, tied to jars of wine that traveled 400 miles, a man in a boat counting cows, 2 crowns on one head, the same picture of somebody being hit, carved and recarved for 3,000 years, a desert that killed anybody who walked into it and saved everything anybody left behind, and 318 graves in neat rows around one man, and by the end you're going to notice something slightly unsettling about what you handed over this month without anybody asking you. Let's go. The thing nobody tells you about the first kings. Here's the version almost everyone has, and it's a good version. It goes like this. The Nile is a big river, and big rivers need managing. Canals have to be dug. Water has to be shared between villages that would otherwise fight over it. Somebody has to coordinate all of that, and whoever ends up coordinating the water ends up holding the power. Kings are what happens when farming gets complicated enough to need a manager. It's tidy, it's mechanical, and it feels true. It largely traces back to a historian named Carl Wittfogel, writing in 1957, who built an entire theory of civilization on it and gave it a name you have to admire: hydraulic despotism. Water makes tyrants, and it's wrong in an interesting way. In 1976, the geographer Karl Butzer went back through the Egyptian evidence looking for the giant coordinated waterworks the theory requires, and they aren't there. Not early, anyway. Early Egyptian irrigation is basin irrigation, and the technology is a wall of dirt. You build a low bank around your field. The flood comes over the top and fills it. You let it sit and soak, then you let it out. One village can run that. One village did run that for centuries with nobody in charge of anything. And this one isn't the usual archaeology problem where the evidence rotted. This is just a good story that stopped being true when somebody went and checked. We didn't find a civilization that needed a manager. We found one that needed an insurer. So forget Egypt for a minute, because the real problem here isn't Egyptian at all. Every animal that stores food is solving the same equation, and there are only 2 ways to solve it. A squirrel solves it privately. It buries 10,000 nuts in 10,000 separate holes and forgets where most of them are. A honeybee solves it collectively. 1 hive, 1 store. Everybody puts in, everybody draws out. Private storage is safe from theft and hopeless at scale. Collective storage is dramatically more efficient, and it needs exactly one thing a squirrel never needs: a rule about who's allowed to open it. I repeat, exactly as you said, and the Nile shoves you toward the bee. Here's why. The flood was perfectly reliable in its timing and completely unreliable in its size. It came in July. Every year, for 5,000 years, what varied was how high, and the difference between a good year and a catastrophe was about a meter of water. We do have hard numbers for that, but I want to be careful with them because they're late. Pliny the Elder, writing around 77 CE, recorded the scale everyone in Egypt still used. 12 cubits meant famine. 13 you'd scrape through. 14 was cheerfulness. 15 was security. 16 was the number people prayed for. That's a Roman writing 3,000 years after the period we're in, so hold it as a scale, not as a measurement. What's solid is the shape. A few feet of water is the whole difference between a normal year and a frightening one. And here's the part nobody thinks about, because it isn't about food, it's about seed. A hungry village eats its stores. A starving village eats its seed grain, the sacks it's supposed to put back in the ground next spring. And the moment you eat the seed, next year is gone too, no matter how perfect the next flood is. That's how famine actually works on a river like this. You don't die in the bad year, you die in the year after the bad year, and you'll go to bed full on the night you seal your own fate. So the real problem was never one bad harvest, it was 2 in a row, and the only defense against 2 in a row is grain that's older than the disaster, which means the whole thing comes down to 3 moves. 1, somebody has to absorb the risk, hold last year's surplus into this year. 2, somebody has to move the surplus from the stretch of river that flooded well to the stretch that didn't. 3, somebody has to own the story and make that arrangement feel non-negotiable in a good year, when handing a third of your harvest to a man you'll never meet is obviously insane. Everything that follows, every bin, every clay tag, every crown, every carved picture of a man swinging a mace is a version of one of those 3. And it's the third one that people write off as decoration. Hold on to that, because it's going to pay off at the end. The hole in the ground with a lid on it. Start with the least glamorous object in Egyptian history, which is also the most important one. Long before anything you'd call a king, people on the edge of the Fayum Lake were digging pits into high ground above the floodline, lining them with basketry, and filling them with emmer wheat and barley. Gertrude Caton Thompson excavated them in the late 1920s and published them in a book called The Desert Fayum in 1934, over 100 grain pits, dating to somewhere around 4,500 BCE, more than 1,000 years before the first name on any king list. And a sealed pit of grain isn't a container, it's a time machine that only runs forward. Wheat that would rot in a damp hut stays good for a year, 2 years, sometimes longer, if it's dry and dark and shut. You've taken this July and moved it into a July that hasn't happened yet. Nobody in the Fayum was theorizing about risk. There were no equations, no plan. They noticed that grain in a dry, sealed pit was still edible 18 months later, and they kept doing the thing that worked. That's how nearly everything in this video gets invented, by not stopping. But look at what a shared pit creates the second more than one family uses it. Somebody holds the seal. Somebody decides, in the bad year, whose children eat first. That is an enormous amount of power, and it was invented by accident, by people trying to keep mice out of wheat. You already use one, by the way. Money in an account you cannot see. Insurance for a fire you don't expect. A pension for a version of you that doesn't exist yet. The oldest financial institution on Earth is a hole in the ground with a lid on it. We've added marble. The tag tied to the jar. Now here's where it gets strange, because the next thing that shows up isn't a weapon or a temple. It's paperwork. At Abydos in 1988, the German archaeologist Gunther Dreyer excavated a tomb catalogued as UJ. Inside were several hundred jars of wine imported from the Levant, and roughly 150 small tags of bone and ivory, each about the size of a postage stamp, each with a hole drilled in one corner so it could be tied to something. Scratched onto those tags is the earliest writing anyone has found in Egypt. Not a poem, not a prayer, not a law. As far as anyone can read them, they're quantities and place names, where this jar came from, how much is in it, whose it is. The count and the date both get argued over. You'll see 3,320 BCE and 3,200 BCE quoted, and the number of tags varies between publications, so hold the specifics loosely. What isn't in dispute is what the tags are for. Writing isn't a technology of memory, it's a technology of distrust. It shows up the moment somebody needs to track goods that are out of their sight, in other people's hands, moving through places they can't watch. Every early writing system on Earth starts in a storeroom, and nobody sat down and invented literature. Some administrator needed to know which jar came from where, scratched a mark on a bone tag, and it worked well enough that the next person copied it. 1,000 years later, that same system is carving hymns into temple walls. Nobody planned that. Nobody planned any of this. So the first thing a human being in Egypt ever wrote down was roughly, "This is mine, and I'm watching it." There's one on the box that came to your door this week. The man in the boat counting cows. Here's the logistics problem. Your grain is in bins scattered along 700 miles of river. Storing it is solved. Labeling it is solved. Now you have to know what you've got and who owes what, and you have to do it without a phone, a map, or a road. The Nile hands you something that feels almost unfair. The current runs north. The prevailing wind blows south. So you sail upstream and you drift downstream, and a loaded boat becomes the cheapest way to move heavy things anywhere in the ancient world. Egypt isn't a country with a river running through it. It's a river with a thin green strip stuck to the sides, and the early kings used it in the most boring way imaginable. There's a slab of royal annals called the Palermo stone, carved around 2400 BCE, listing what happened year by year going back to the beginning, and the entry that recurs over and over is something called the following of Horus. The king sails the river every 2 years, counting cattle. Not conquering, not praying, counting. It mattered so much that they dated the calendar by it. Years get named things like the year of the 5th occasion of the count. Your fiscal year exists in a traceable line because somebody had to count cows, and this isn't genius statecraft either. It's a man in a boat doing the only thing available. Show up, look at it yourself, and be seen looking. The state didn't begin as a capital city or a constitution. It began as a schedule. Also, notice what's on both sides of him while he sails. Nothing. Sand. Hold that thought about the desert, because we're coming back to it, and I'm going to argue you're looking at it completely wrong. 2 crowns on one head. Now, the part that looks like decoration and isn't. In 1898, at Hierakonpolis, 2 British archaeologists, James Quibell and Frederick Green, lifted a flat slab of green-grey stone out of a temple deposit, 63 centimeters tall, about 2 feet. We call it the Narmer palette, and it dates to around 3100 BCE. On one face, the king wears a tall white crown. On the other face, the same man wears a squat red crown. 2 hats, 1 head, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, worn by one person in one object. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of object that gets flattened on the internet into the palette proves Narmer conquered the north in a war. It doesn't prove that. It's a picture made by his own people, and reading it as a news report is a choice. What it does show is that somebody very early worked out you could put 2 territories on one skull and let the image do the arguing. Because the crown isn't jewelry, it's a uniform. And a uniform is a sentence you can read from 100 meters away in a country where almost nobody can read anything. The same period gives you the Serek, the king's name written inside a little drawing of a palace facade with a falcon standing on top, and it gets stamped onto jars and ceilings up and down the river. A logo on the packaging. Nobody workshopped this. Some ruler wore a distinctive hat because the last one had. People carved the hat because it was recognizable, and after a few generations the hat meant more than the man underneath it, which you already know, because you already obey clothes. You slow down for one particular paint job on a car. You stand up when a specific robe enters a room. That reflex is 5,000 years old, and it works on you every single week. Before the last chapter, if this is your kind of thing, ancient daily life told from the bottom up rather than the throne down, that's the whole point of this channel, and there's a growing pile of it here already. Everything we know about how ordinary Egyptians actually lived, ate, worked, and worried in the same format as this. Links in the description. Now, the picture they couldn't stop carving. The same picture for 3,000 years. Also at Hierakonpolis in 1899, Frederick Green recorded a painted wall in a tomb, now known as Tomb 100, dating to somewhere around 3400 BCE. Among the boats and animals, there's a figure raising a weapon over a group of smaller bound figures. That's the earliest version of a pose Egyptologists call the smiting scene. Big king, raised mace, kneeling captives held by the hair, and then it never stops. It's on the narmer palette, it's on temple walls in the New Kingdom, 1500 years later. It's still being carved when Roman emperors are being drawn as pharaohs on temples they never visited, which means at some point, very early, it stopped being a record of anything. It isn't a photograph of a battle, it's a screensaver, the same image in the same place generation after generation, saying nothing except the arrangement still holds. They didn't design a propaganda system. They repeated an image because repeating was cheaper than explaining, and the repetition became the argument. We do it exactly. The flag behind the podium, the seal on the lectern, none of it informs you of anything. It isn't supposed to, and here's the detail that gets me. Green drew that wall, and the tomb was afterward effectively lost. We have the drawings, we don't have the room, and there's a harder chapter here, because I'm not going to hand you a tidy story about grain insurance and leave the rest out. At Abydos, between 1899 and 1901, Flinders Petrie excavated the tomb of a First Dynasty king called Djer, around 2900 BCE. Around the burial were subsidiary graves, smaller, simpler, packed in neat rows. 318 of them in the count that usually gets quoted, with hundreds more at a separate enclosure nearby. Most of the people in them were young. Some of those graves had small stone markers with names on them. We know some of their names. Whether they were killed at the funeral or died separately and were buried around him afterward is genuinely debated, and it should be. But the rows are regular, the graves are contemporary, and the strong reading is that a lot of people went into the ground at the same time as the king. So the same civilization that invented public grain storage, a genuinely humane piece of technology that kept villages alive through bad years, also, in at least one place we've dug, buried 318 people around one man to make a point. Both are true. Anyone who hands you only the first half is selling you something. Now, here's the part that changes the question. For the last 15 minutes, I've treated the desert as scenery. The blank space either side of the green. It isn't scenery. It's the reason any of this worked, and it's the loop I asked you to hold. In 1970, the anthropologist Robert Carnero published an argument in the journal Science that states don't appear where farmland is open. They appear where farmland is boxed in, by desert, by mountains, by sea, so that the people who lose an argument have nowhere to go. He called it circumscription. Everywhere else on Earth, the answer to a man demanding a third of your grain is to walk away and farm somewhere else. In the Nile Valley, the strip of black soil is in places about 10 miles wide, and on both sides of it is a desert that will kill you inside a day and a half, so you can't leave. And once you can't leave, it stops being a deal and becomes a fact, like the flood. Now go back and reread the chapters. The bins on the high ground aren't generous, they're leverage, because there is no second granary over the hill. The man in the boat isn't brave for sailing alone into the interior. There is no interior. He's sailing down a corridor where every single household is already boxed in on both sides, and the two crowns on one head only work as an image in a country shaped like a line, where one man really can stand at the top of it. And it compounds because the desert did a second job. Mud brick dissolves. Damp ground eats bone and linen and ink. Dry sand keeps everything, which is exactly why we have the tags, the palette, the linen, and the bodies with their names still beside them. So Egypt looks like the birthplace of kingship, partly because Egypt is where the receipts survived. The desert didn't surround the kingdom, it closed it. Let's take a step back and put it together, because there are three things here and they build on each other. First, the practical one, the thing that made kings possible was not the mace and not the crown. It was storage. A sealed bin of grain is the first machine that could carry a village across a bad year, and the moment one existed, somebody had to hold the seal. Power here is a side effect of food safety. Second, the cultural one. All the stuff we file as decoration, the crowns, the palette, the falcon on the name, the man swinging a mace at nobody in particular for 3 millennia, is not decoration, and it isn't quite propaganda either. It's interface. It's how you make an arrangement legible to a population that can't read, across a country too long to walk, in a world with no other way to broadcast anything. Third, and this is the one, we tend to imagine hierarchy as something done to people. A strong man showed up and took over. That's not what the evidence looks like. It looks like a price people paid, semi-voluntarily, for something they genuinely wanted, which was a smaller chance of catastrophe. You give up a third of the harvest and the variance goes down. That's the trade, and it's a rational trade. The catch is that the day you cannot walk away from it is the day it stops being a trade at all, and nobody in Egypt got to pick that day. The desert picked it. And the caveat, as always, almost everything solid in this video comes from royal cemeteries at Abydos and Hierakonpolis and a handful of excavated elite sites, which is to say, from the state's own paperwork about itself. The farmer in a mud village in the Delta who actually handed over the grain, who is the entire point of the story, and the overwhelming majority of the people in it, left us essentially nothing. He's invisible, he always is. Here's what I keep coming back to, that riverbank. Last week of August, 3101 BCE. Same spot, and now you know what every object in it is for. Brown water 6 meters up the bank, a field wall you built with your own hands, holding your share of it, a line of mud brick bins on the high ground behind you, sealed with wet clay and stamped with a falcon, a boat coming downstream with a man on it who can write, and a second man behind him counting your cattle out loud, bone tags on the jars in the hold. 200 miles upriver, in a temple you will never enter, a slab of green stone with a picture of somebody being hit. 10 miles that way, sand. 10 miles the other way, sand. And a man on a boat who doesn't own your land. He owns next year. You'll do a version of this today. Some fraction of what you earn will move, before it ever touches your hands, into a system that promises to be holding something for you when things go wrong. You'll trust a stranger because of what they're wearing. You'll feel something you can't fully justify when a flag goes past. Same trade. Same species. Same meter of water between a normal year and a frightening one. The only real difference is that the Egyptian farmer could stand in his field and see the bins his grain went into and watch who got fed first when the flood came in low. You can't see yours. That's not an upgrade, that's the same machine with the windows painted over, because the answer was never fear, and it was never one clever man with a stick. It was grain, distance, and a story nobody could afford to argue with. So, question for you, and you have to actually pick one. Option 1, the Egyptian deal, a third of everything you grow, every year, forever, to a man you will never meet, and in the bad year the bins open and your children eat. Option 2, you keep every grain you grow, all of it, nobody takes a thing, and in the bad year there is no bin, no man, and no help coming. Which one do you take? Let me know in the comments. Until then, see you soon.